Welcome back to The Explainer. So today we're diving into something that affects a huge number of people, but honestly is so rarely understood on a deep level. We're talking about the debilitating, endlessly spinning reality of chronic dizziness. I mean, if you've ever felt like the room literally just won't stop moving, or like your own body is betraying you every single time you try to stand up or walk, you know exactly how exhausting this is. It feels like your internal gyroscope is just permanently broken. But what if the latest research suggests it isn't actually broken at all? Think about that for a second. What if your brain just forgot how to balance? This concept completely shifts how we look at the problem. You see, the system isn't irreparably damaged. Your brain has simply learned the wrong survival strategy. It adapted to a noisy environment in a way that is now keeping you stuck. So today, we're going straight to the source material to figure out exactly how we can unlearn that strategy. The sources break this recovery process down into a really clear roadmap with 5 steps. We've got 1, the dizziness loop, 2, the sensory pivot, 3, finding your zero position, 4, the adaptation hierarchy, and finally 5, reestablishing sensory matching. Let's jump right in. Starting off with section 1, the dizziness loop. Before we can fix anything, the research says we've got to understand how people get stuck in this constant state of hypervigilance in the first place. A lot of you might actually know this condition as PPPD, which stands for Persistent Postural Perceptual Dizziness. And what's really fascinating here is that PPPD is so frequently mischaracterized in general practice. A lot of times, it's treated as just a software problem, like a recursive glitch where the brain makes this over-precise threat prediction, and it traps the person in this loop of constant hypervigilance. Now, don't get me wrong, that threat-based loop is a very real part of what you're feeling, but traditional models completely miss the underlying physical reality. If we look at the latest clinical insights, specifically the 2024 active inference model, it shows that the brain is essentially failing to filter out sensory errors. It starts treating the entire environment and literally every movement you make within it as a constant threat to your stability. But here's the massive takeaway from the research. This so-called software error, it's actually being driven by a hardware problem. Which brings us perfectly to section 2, the sensory pivot. Let's look at how this builds into the true aha moment of today's explainer, the actual anatomy of someone who is stuck. Okay, so in a healthy system, your vision acts as your primary navigator. It handles all the fine details and high-frequency movements. Meanwhile, your vestibular and somatosensory systems, so your inner ear and your body's physical senses, those are your silent stabilizers. They quietly work in the background to give you your baseline sense of gravity. But when those stabilizers get noisy, maybe from an injury, a really bad migraine, or some neck issues, the brain absolutely panics. It executes what researchers call a sensory pivot. The systems completely trade jobs. Your vision desperately tries to become the stabilizer by locking onto the horizon, while your injured, noisy physical senses are suddenly forced to navigate. Honestly, it's like asking your accountant to suddenly fly a helicopter. Nobody's having a good time, and the whole thing is spinning out of control. This whole mess creates what's called an advanced visual vestibular mismatch, or VVM for short. Think about it. You simply cannot navigate with primitive systems that were originally designed to stay quiet in the background, and you absolutely cannot stabilize your body using a super active visual navigator. When your eyes pick up movement in the room, they suddenly interpret it as true physical motion, and it throws your balance completely out of whack. This complete hardware reversal is the real reason people stay stuck. All right, section 3, finding your zero position. Now that we know the hardware is basically wired backward, how do we fix it? How do we get the brain to let go of this maladaptive visual grip? Well, the source material outlines this really practical clinical protocol called the zero-out method. It's broken down into 3 structural phases. First, finding the zero-out position. Second, climbing a behavioral adaptation hierarchy. And third, reestablishing sensory matching. This is where we move away from the abstract theories and get right into the step-by-step action plan. It all begins at 0. 0 is your place of absolute, unquestionable safety. Because dealing with PPPD means you have to give your brain undeniable, high-precision proof that you are safe. The protocol dictates finding a physical posture where your symptoms are 100% gone, or at the absolute bare minimum possible. For most folks, this means lying completely flat on your back in a supine position. According to the protocol, you have to be able to simply exist in this zero-symptom baseline before you even think about moving. Moving on to section 4, the adaptation hierarchy. Once you've established that absolute safety, we move to the most critical phase of the whole recovery journey, learning how to move away from that baseline without waking up the dizziness. There's a really authoritative insight here from researchers Lacour and Bernard Demont. They point out that early, active, and specific movement is vastly superior to passive habituation. This protocol isn't just telling you to get used to being dizzy, which is kind of what traditional habituation does, right? That's essentially asking you to just live with a broken system. Instead, you need active, specific movement to actually fix the underlying system. The goal here is true adaptation and substitution, not just numbing your brain to the spinning. To pull this off, the method relies heavily on the scientific principle of Hebbian learning. You've probably heard the phrase, neurons that fire together wire together. That bad central strategy, where your eyes are desperately gripping the room for balance, has to be broken so we can wire in a brand new, healthy strategy. And the only way that happens is through massive, completely asymptomatic repetition. This physical journey actually looks a lot like a developmental hierarchy. It's super similar to watching a baby learn how to move. You start flat on your back at 0. You learn to just roll to your side without any dizziness, then from your side to your stomach, then pushing up onto your hands and knees. After that, up to tall kneeling, half kneeling, and finally pulling yourself up into a chair. The goal is to slowly, meticulously relearn motion from the floor up, proving to your brain at every single inch that movement is perfectly safe. Now here is why this is absolutely crucial, and if you take away nothing else from this explainer, remember this: mastery is mandatory. In this protocol, if you roll onto your side and you feel even a little bit dizzy, you do not push through it. No way. You do not progress. You stay right there, go back to 0, and repeat it until your brain accepts the movement as safe and stops that visual grip. You only climb to the next rung on the ladder when the current step is completely effortless. Which takes us to the final step, Section 5, Reestablishing Sensory Matching. Let's say you've mastered moving from the floor up to the chair with 0 symptoms. Now you enter the final phase where we put the brain's new programming to the ultimate test. The protocol actually requires you to repeat that entire physical hierarchy under 3 very specific environmental conditions, just to make absolutely sure the systems are matched up correctly. Condition number 1 is called the navigator. Here, your vision is stable. You repeat the movements, but this time you're using your eyes properly, just to guide your movement and ensure perfect posture, rather than using them to desperately grip onto the room for stability. Next up, we take the eyes completely out of the equation. Researchers call this the dark room. You literally repeat the entire hierarchy of movement blindfolded or with your eyes closed. And this is incredibly powerful. By eliminating your vision, the protocol forcefully denies the brain that maladaptive visual grip. It demands that your brain places its trust back into the vestibular and somatosensory systems, those primitive silent stabilizers that were supposed to be holding you up this whole time. And finally, the ultimate test, the noisy navigator. You perform the movements while being exposed to visual conflict, so things like moving visual environments, optokinetic flow, or just a really busy room. This step teaches your newly recalibrated brain how to handle environmental motion without completely panicking. It proves to your nervous system that a busy environment is just information to navigate through, not a threat to your physical stability. So, what does this all mean? Well, this perfectly illustrates the ultimate goal of the research. It's all about shifting from a maladaptive substitution, where your system's essentially panicked and traded jobs just to survive, to a state of true adaptive recovery. By finding that asymptomatic baseline and meticulously climbing the hierarchy, you aren't just getting used to the dizziness. You are actively reprogramming the neural weighting of your sensory systems. You're restoring the natural order, putting vision back in the navigator seat and the physical senses back in the stabilizer seat. And that is how you finally achieve effortless balance. I want to leave you with this final, somewhat provocative thought today. If your brain was smart enough to learn how to be dizzy just to survive a noisy situation, it is entirely capable of unlearning it. So, what steps will you take today to teach it how to balance again? The zero-out method is proof that recovery isn't just possible, it's actually incredibly logical. Thanks so much for joining me as we unpacked this source material on the explainer today. And hey, here's to finding your absolute zero.